Narrative and point of view, different meanings separately, but together, they constitute a concept you must understand in English ATAR.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Past WACE exam questions. Here are all the times the concept, narrative, point of view has appeared in past WACE exam questions between 2016 2022. Once in 2017, evaluate the way narrative point of view is used in two texts to convey specific values. Once in 2019, analyze how the central characters' attitudes are represented through the narrative point of view used in text 2. At the time of recording, this concept has not appeared in a past WACE exam question in 3 or 4 years. I wouldn't be surprised if it pops up in your WACE exam. And here is the one syllabus point that mentions the concept. Analyzing the use of voice and narrative point of view, Unit 4, Syllabus Point 5. I mentioned at the end of the previous lesson on characterization that this concept of narrative point of view is one of the most important to understand. You might be considering why that is, considering it only appeared in 2 past WACE exams and it pops up in 1 syllabus point. I'll answer that question with another question. You know how I've said a bunch of times throughout this module that just because concept X doesn't appear in a question, it doesn't mean that you can't discuss concept X in that question. That statement couldn't be more true for this concept of narrative POV. Put differently, narrative POV is one of the most underrated concepts in that you can incorporate a discussion of it in a lot of responses, even though the question doesn't actually include the concept of narrative POV in it. Further to that point, understanding narrative POV complements and in some cases is necessary to understand various other concepts that we'll be discussing in the second half of Module 2 of this module. No surprises that one of those concepts is voice, because it literally appears in the same syllabus point as narrative POV. Lesson objectives. We'll define narrative POV. We'll explain that narrative POV doesn't equal perspective. Narrative POV doesn't equal perspective. Explain the application of narrative POV in an exam context. Outline the main questions to ask when you're analyzing narrative POV. Explain the first question, who is the narrator, person telling the story. Explain the second question, what point of view does the narrator tell the story from? And explain the third question, how can we describe the narrator? Then we'll discuss the interplay between types of POV and types of narrators. From there, we'll analyze a past WACE exam question and outline a simple summary. First up, definition of narrative point of view. Let's see what the SCARSA glossary has to say about it. The ways in which a narrator may be related to the story. For example, the narrator might take the role of first or third person, omniscient or restricted in knowledge of events, reliable or unreliable in interpreting what happens. Text can have multiple narrative points of view. The first sentence is the one that we're going to use for our definition of this concept. So, our definition of narrative POV is the ways in which a narrator may be related to the story. As is typically the case with a definition, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense without contextualizing it. Before we do that, I'd like to take a moment to emphasize a crucial point. Surprise, surprise, narrative POV does not equal perspective. I mention this because in the real world, outside of this bubble of English ATAR, the terms POV and perspective are synonymous or interchangeable. But in the world of English ATAR, they're not. In this lesson, we're going to learn about narrative POV, and in a few lessons after this one, we'll learn about perspective and how it's different from narrative POV. For now, I just want you to be aware of the following distinction. Perspective is a viewpoint held by someone in the story, whereas narrative POV is simply the person who's telling the story. And that, in a nutshell, is how perspective and narrative POV are different. For example, in Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, Kang the Conqueror's perspective is that the multiverse should be conquered. Whereas the person narrating the story, the narrative POV, is Ant-Man. At the beginning of the movie, he is narrating the story, and then at the end, he narrates the end of the story. It's a very basic example, but I just wanted to outline the fundamental difference between these two concepts. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of these differences in the lesson on perspective. Another important thing to note concerns when this concept of narrative POV is and isn't relevant for you in an exam context. In essence, narrative POV is relevant whenever you're analyzing or creating a narrative. Obviously, that requires a clear understanding of what a narrative actually is. Turning to the SCARSA glossary again, a story of events or experiences, real or imagined. In literary theory, narrative includes the story, what is narrated, and the discourse, how it is narrated. From this definition, we can create our own definition of a narrative. It's quite simply a real or imagined story. Okay, what have we learned so far? Firstly, narrative POV is applicable in narratives. Secondly, narratives are real or imagined stories. Taking it a step further, we also know that some non-fictional texts are narratives, yet fictional texts are narratives. To drive this point home, we're going to check out this table. It might look familiar. We looked at it in the lesson on genre, and I've reproduced it here to show you the sort of text you could expect to analyze narrative POV in. The relevant texts are underlined, and as always, you can find a copy of this in the PDF study notes for this lesson. Returning to the overarching question of this part of the lesson, when is this concept of narrative POV relevant in an exam context? We once again find ourselves looking at the difference between analytical questions and creative questions. Analytical questions are from the comprehending section and responding section. Creative questions are from the composing section. Narrative POV is applicable in analytical questions when you're analyzing a real or imagined story. Narrative POV is applicable in creative questions when you're creating an imaginative text. I've alluded to this already, but just to be clear, how can we determine whether a text is a real or imagined story? i.e., how can we determine whether it's a narrative? If you're analyzing a fictional text, there's scope to discuss narrative POV, because fictional texts are narratives. If you're analyzing a non-fictional text, if a substantial part of it tells a story, there's scope to discuss narrative POV. All right, now we know when narrative POV is relevant in an exam context. Now let's take a more in-depth look at this concept of narrative POV. These are the main questions to ask when you're analyzing narrative POV. Note the use of the word analyzing, which tells us that these are the questions that you should ask yourself when you're using or incorporating, addressing the term narrative POV in the comprehending section or responding section. Here's an overview of these main questions, and we'll address each one in more detail separately after. Firstly, who is the narrator, person telling the story? Secondly, what point of view does the narrator tell the story from? Thirdly, how can we describe the narrator? If we want to simplify these questions even further, we can just think of the first one as having to do with the narrator, the second one as having to do with the type of point of view, and then the third one focusing on the type of narrator. A little bit confusing, but once we go through each question, you'll know what I mean in distilling the questions into these main points. Starting with the first question, who is the narrator/person telling the story? It's the easiest part of the analysis, and it depends entirely on the specific text. A classic example that some of you may be familiar with is The Handmaid's Tale. This is a novel belonging to the dystopia genre of subject matter, and it was adapted into a TV series a few years ago. The person telling the story in The Handmaid's Tale is the protagonist, Offred. Next question, what point of view does the narrator tell the story from? This second question is the most important for you to answer, and this is really getting at the types of POV. Our first type is first-person POV. It involves using pronouns like I, me, and my, and there are certain subtypes of this type of first-person POV. Our first subtype is first-person central POV. Our definition for this one is when the narrator equals the main character and describes events from their own perspective. Effects: the narrator has a close relationship with the audience. The audience is positioned to accept the main character's version of events. The narrator depicts one side of the story, which can be a biased or narrow depiction of events. Example of this one is The Catcher in the Rye, written by J.D. Salinger. Holden Caulfield, the protagonist, tells the story from his own naive point of view. I was wondering where the ducks went when the lagoon got all icy and frozen over. I wondered if some guy came in a truck and took them away to a zoo or something, or if they just flew away. Notice the use of the vertical pronoun here. Next subtype of first person POV is first person peripheral. Here, the narrator is not the main character, but someone who's close enough to the main character to tell their story. Effects: the narrator keeps the focus on the protagonist while retaining some distance, and this is typically used when the main character is not someone the audience can empathize with, or the author wants to make the main character mysterious or enigmatic. Example is The Great Gatsby, written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. In this book, Nick Carraway tells the story of Jay Gatsby. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all. Came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. If you've seen the movie adaptation of The Great Gatsby, you might recall that Tobey Maguire plays Nick Carraway. Spider-Man. That is first person POV and our two subtypes, first person central and first person peripheral. Our next type of POV is second person POV. Pronouns, you and your. Definition: the narrator can be any character who directly addresses the audience. Effects: using the second person POV draws the audience into the story and makes the audience feel part of the action. It can create an interactive experience for the audience, and it implies the reader is the protagonist or another character in the story, as though they're actually experiencing the events that take place in the story. A few notes: this type of POV is rarely used in narratives as it's hard to execute. Also, this is not the same as the rhetorical device direct address. If I'm giving a persuasive speech and I address the audience using the pronouns you and your, I'm trying to engage the audience by directly addressing them. Second person POV takes this a step further. It's when you, the reader or viewer, are addressed by the author in a way that makes you feel like you're an actual character in the story. Example of this is Black Mirror Bandersnatch, written by Charlie Booker. It's on Netflix, not sure if you've seen it. Basically, the viewer decides what's going to happen in the movie. It's a choose your own adventure style of movie. I've included a link to the featurette of Black Mirror Bandersnatch in the resources tab below this video. Feel free to go and check it out. It's not compulsory or essential for the purposes of this lesson, but if you do go and watch it, come back once you're done. That is second person POV. Our next type is third person POV. Pronouns include they, them, their, theirs, it, he, him, his, she, her, hers. Definition for the first subtype, which is third person limited, subjective, is the narrator is nameless and unidentified in the text, and they follow the experiences and thoughts of one character. Effects: using the third person limited POV limits what the reader sees in the story by controlling what information is given. It also builds interest and heightens suspense, and it can be considered subjective due to its focus on one character. Hence this word subjective. Example: Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, written by J.K. Rowling, closely follows the experiences of Harry Potter. Something very painful was going on in Harry's mind. As Hagrid's story came to a close, he saw again the blinding flash of green light more clearly than he had ever remembered it before. And he remembered something else for the first time in his life: a high, cold, cruel laugh. Hagrid was watching him sadly. Note the use of the pronouns he, his, and him. Next subtype of third person POV is third person objective. Definition: the narrator is nameless and unidentified and observes dialogue and experiences of characters, but doesn't provide access to their feelings or thoughts. Effects: the story can appear more unbiased because the narrator is neutral. It creates an observational tone and positions the reader as a fly on the wall. A few notes. Firstly, this is fairly uncommon. And secondly, the storyteller can only narrate what they would see or hear as if they were present in the story or the particular scene or moment. Example is Hills Like White Elephants, written by Ernest Hemingway. The narrator observes a conversation between a man and a woman about abortion. And you think then we'll be all right and be happy. I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it. So have I, said the girl. And afterward, they were all so happy. Well, the man said, if you don't want to, you don't have to. I wouldn't have you do it if you didn't want to. But I know it's perfectly simple. And you really want to? So, with third person objective, once again, the key kind of phrase that I like to remember when understanding what this type of POV is a fly on the wall. Imagine I am a little fly on the wall watching these two people have the conversation. I'm narrating their conversation by saying, well, the girl said this, and then the man said that, and then the girl said this, and the man said that. It's very objective. I'm literally just observing what they're doing, but I don't have access to their thoughts and feelings while they're saying these things. Our next subtype of third person POV is third person omniscient. Definition: the narrator is nameless and unidentified and is all seeing and provides access to the experiences and thoughts of all characters. Effects: the narration can seem more balanced and trustworthy as the omniscient narrator knows everything about the story and its characters. Third person omniscient POV also swiftly establishes characters and events, and the reader has a more distant relationship with characters. Example is Gossip Girl. Gossip Girl follows the lives of a group of privileged teenagers from the Upper East Side of New York as they transition from high school to college. That's the second main question to ask when you're analyzing narrative POV. Before we move to the third question, a very important key takeaway. Whenever you're analyzing narrative POV in an exam, it's vital that you clearly state which type or types of POV is used. This might sound obvious, but you wouldn't believe how many responses I've read that have just skirted around actually directly stating what type of narrative POV is used. If you're discussing narrative POV, markers want to see you, need to see you state the type of POV. Think of it as a checkbox in their mind. Focus on clarity of expression and state the POV. Also, note that a text can switch between types of POV. I don't say this to confuse you, but to hopefully make your study of a text narrative POV a bit easier. For instance, if you're unsure if the POV is first person central or second person, the text may well use a mixture of both throughout. Like all other concepts in English ATAR, the various types of narrative point of view don't exist separately from one another. Third main question to ask when analyzing narrative POV is how can we describe the narrator, or quite simply, type of narrator. There are two broad types of narrators: internal narrators and external narrators. Let's discuss internal narrators first. When we have an internal narrator, the narrator is a character in the story. They're internal to the story. Internal narrators can generally be described as unreliable or reliable. Let's look at unreliable internal narrators first. The narrator can be described as unreliable because he, she, or they exaggerates or lies. If they exaggerate, they're regarded as the picaro in literary theory, and if they lie, they're regarded as just the liar. Sometimes these two titles, the picaro and the liar, are referred to separately. I've decided to join them together because they are very similar. Rationale: they're unreliable because the narrator embellishes or fabricates stories. Note the difference between exaggerating and lying. To exaggerate something is to represent something as more extreme or important than it actually is, whereas lying is just an intentionally false statement. For me to say year 12 is the most important year of your life is clearly not an exaggeration. No, I'm just joking. That is a huge exaggeration. For me to say English ATAR is the worst subject ever is clearly a lie. Example, we have Rue in Euphoria. Some other good examples of unreliable internal narrators are Amy and Nick from Gone Girl, which was a book adapted into a movie, and also Verbal Kint from The Usual Suspects. That last one, The Usual Suspects, is a classic movie. It probably has one of the best plot twists ever, up there with Fight Club, maybe even better. It's highly recommended if you haven't seen it. Another type of unreliable internal narrator is the madman. The madman is unreliable because the narrator is mentally detached from reality. Example, we have Joe Goldberg in You. It's a TV series and it's an adaptation of Caroline Kepnes's series of novels. Some other examples, we've got Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. It's a movie and it's an adaptation of Bret Easton Ellis's book. And speaking of Fight Club, another crazy, unreliable internal narrator is Tyler Durden from Fight Club, a movie and it's an adaptation of Chuck Palahniuk's book. The last subtype of unreliable internal narrators is the NAIF. They're unreliable because the narrator is inexperienced, young, and/or ignorant. Example is Forrest Gump in Forrest Gump. This was originally a book written by Winston Groom, and as you know, probably, it was adapted into a movie. Other examples include Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye and Huckleberry Finn in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That one written by Mark Twain, a book adapted into a movie. Okay, that is unreliable internal narrators. How about reliable internal narrators? Quite simply, they are reliable because the narrator can truthfully and credibly tell the story. As the audience, we have reason to believe, whatever that reason may be, that what the narrator is saying is truthful. The narrator is legit. How can you determine whether a narrator is unreliable or reliable? To keep it simple, if they don't fall into one of those three categories of unreliable narrators, exaggerates or lies, is crazy, is naive, if they don't fall into any one of those three, they're probably reliable. That brings us to an important mini key takeaway, and that is unreliable internal narrators call for more analysis than reliable internal narrators simply because there's more juicy stuff to discuss for unreliable narrators. That's why we didn't go into much detail for reliable narrators. We've looked at internal narrators and specifically unreliable internal narrators and reliable internal narrators. Now let's put internal narrators to one side and look at external narrators. This is where the narrator is not a character in the story, they are external to the story. There are 4 types of external narrators: detached, subjective, omniscient, and intrusive. Before we take a look at each one, it's important to note that while an internal narrator can be regarded as unreliable or reliable, one or the other, an external narrator can be regarded as one or more of these 4. An external narrator could be detached and omniscient. Let's take a look at detached external narrators first. Definition: this is when the narrator tells the story or part of the story without making the audience privy to the inner thoughts and feelings of characters. Notes: the narrator is detached from the thoughts and feelings of characters, and events are told objectively. A good example for this one is the Royal Tenenbaums. There's a link in the resources tab below this video of Alec Baldwin's narration in the Royal Tenenbaums, which will give you a good idea of what detached narration looks like. Go give it a watch, come back once you're done. Next type is subjective external narrators. Definition: the narrator reveals the thoughts and feelings of one or more characters to the audience. Notes: quite simply the opposite of detached narration. And this is an effective way of telling the audience how a particular character feels about an event. Example: Game of Thrones. Written by George R.R. Martin, each chapter is written from the third-person limited point of view of one of 8 characters. The audience knows the thoughts and feelings of the focal character, but not the thoughts and feelings of other characters in that chapter. Next type is omniscient external narration. Definition: where the narrator conveys the viewpoints, thoughts, feelings of one or more characters. Notes: firstly, omniscient just means all-knowing. Secondly, omniscient external narrators present the audience with information that isn't available to the characters of the story. A key distinction between subjective and omniscient external narrators is that the latter presents the audience with information that isn't available to the characters of the story. Example: The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, written by C.S. Lewis. The narrator alternates between providing insights into the thoughts and actions of Aslan, Edmund, and Lucy. Intrusive external narration. This is where the narrator comments on scenes, events, and/or characters depicted in the story. Notes: the narrator explains details of the story that may be hard for the audience to understand, and the narrator creates an intimate relationship with the audience. We've got 2 iconic examples for intrusive narration: The Wolf of Wall Street and The Big Short. As usual, relevant links are in the resources tab below the video. Go check them out. come back once you're done, stay on track. Those are our 3 main questions to ask when analysing narrative POV. Last thing we're going to look at before taking a look at a past WACE exam question is how the types of point of view interact with the types of narrators. We've got a table. Type of POV, type of narrator. If we have first person central POV, we've got an internal narrator who can be unreliable or reliable. If we've got first person peripheral POV, we've got an internal narrator who can be unreliable or reliable. If we've got third person limited POV, we've got an external narrator who is subjective and potentially intrusive. If we have third person objective POV, the external narrator is detached and potentially intrusive. Finally, if we have third person omniscient point of view, we have an external narrator who is, surprise, surprise, omniscient and potentially intrusive. I encourage you to pause the video now and try and figure out why I've linked each type of POV with these types of narration. If we go all the way back to that lesson on how to learn in Module 1, burning these mental calories to figure it out yourself will help you ultimately learn this concept better. Hopefully you've had a think. If you still can't figure it out, this next table should clarify it. Our definition for type of POV is simply the distance from which the narrator tells the protagonist's story. Examples: firstly, the narrator is the protagonist, which means we've got first person central POV, and is therefore closest to the protagonist version of the story. Another example: the narrator is not a character but follows the experiences and thoughts of several characters, third person omniscient point of view, and is therefore furthest from the protagonist's version of the story. Key word in this part of the table is distance. If I am the protagonist in a story and I am narrating the story, I am closest to the protagonist's story. If my best mate is narrating my story, they're a little bit further away from my story than I am. It's a matter of distance. Type of narrator is the narrator's method of narration. Examples: the narrator is the protagonist, first person central POV, and is mentally detached from reality. Here we've got internal unreliable narrator, aka the madman. Versus the narrator closely follows the experiences and thoughts of one character, third person limited POV, and occasionally offers opinions about the character's actions, omniscient intrusive narration. Overall, we've got the distance from which the narrator tells the protagonist's story for type of POV, and then for type of narrator, it's simply the way in which the narrator narrates. Moving on to a past exam question. The question we're going to look at is analyze how the central character's attitudes are represented through the narrative point of view used in Text 2, 2019 WACE exam, section 1, question 2. Our sample text is an extract from the short story Nullius by the Western Australian writer Amanda Curtin. The extract is in the PDF study notes. Follow along as I read it out. The girl is supposed to be keeping an eye on her younger brother, but in truth, she takes every chance to lose him. Losing him is easy. A goanna and a stick are all it takes. She is far ahead of him on this hot spring day. Sun stipples through the canopy above her hatless head. She trails a whip of wattle, picking her way over fallen boughs and threading through slimy reeds. Bare feet squelching. Scum ripples the surface of the creek in greens and greys. It's not deep, she knows that, but still she wonders, how shallow is too shallow to drown? The thought makes her stop for one guilty moment, and then she moves on again, shaking her head. He's not that young, not that stupid. The creek is full of gilgies, and you can sweet talk them into your scoop net with a bit of gristle or bacon rind tied to a string. Her gran loves gilgies. She boils them up in a big pot, then pulls off the heads, spits the tails, squealing as the hot shells nip at her fingertips. Pop sniffs at that. He can't be bothered with shelling, but he'll smash the claws with a hammer and suck out the meat. She hasn't brought the net and bucket today. Before long, she'll be reaching the strands of rusty wire that mark the boundary between her grandparents' farm and the next property, which used to be a dairy farm owned by Uncle Jack, but now has a brown tennis court cut into the old pear orchard. The new owners are never there. She could slip over the wires, she's done it before. Or she could turn back, check on her brother. That's what she should do. Instead, she shuts her eyes, tips her face to the sky, and twirls until everything she's been thinking breaks apart and her head is full of air and bits of words. Whichever direction she's facing when she stops, that's where she'll walk. That's the extract. Let's move on to the analysis of narrative POV. As we now know, there are 3 questions to ask when we're analysing narrative POV, starting with who is the narrator. In that excerpt, the narrator is nameless and unidentified. Next question, what is the type of POV? Third person limited. Why? The narrator follows the experiences and thoughts of one character, and the pronouns she and her are used. Effects. The third person limited narration enables readers to peer inside the mind of the central character, who's the girl who's considering trying to run away from her brother. It also makes the audience privy to her whimsical thoughts pertaining to looking after her younger brother, the environment, living off the land, self-sufficiency, and her grandparents. Final question, what is the type of narration? The type of narration is external, subjective, and intrusive narration. The type of POV is third person, so we know that the type of narration will be external. And specifically, the type of POV is limited, so we know the type of narration will be subjective. We'll touch on the intrusive part in a second. Those are the things we'd want to map out before even thinking about actually answering the question. In terms of how we'd answer it, the question is asking us how narrative POV represents the central character's attitudes. In light of that, there are 2 main parts of the question. The first part is the term narrative POV, which, as we've just established, is third person limited, subjective, and intrusive narration. Type of POV, type of narration. And the second part is the central character's attitudes. We're talking about attitudes in the next lesson, so I won't go into it in too much depth here, but in a nutshell, the question states attitudes, plural, not attitude. So we need to talk about at least 2 attitudes. Also, an attitude must be directed towards something, otherwise it's kind of pointless. For example, if you're trying to communicate to your mate that you have a resentful attitude towards studying, you wouldn't say, I resent. In that comment, there's no subject of your resentment. Instead, you'd say, I resent studying. Studying is the subject of your resentment. The attitude must be directed towards something. So, in my opinion, the central character has a decent amount to say about her brother, and because she seems to be quite conflicted as to her responsibility for him, we could actually discuss 2 different attitudes that the girl has towards her younger brother: reckless abandon and begrudging responsibility. So, where are we at? We know what the 2 individual parts of the question are. The trickiest part is explaining how one leads to the other. Let's check out a sample response to see how we can link both parts of the question. Text 2 uses a third-person limited point of view to represent 2 conflicting attitudes the central character, the girl, has towards her brother: reckless abandon and begrudging responsibility. The external yet subjective narration reveals the girl's impulse to abandon her brother. For instance, the narrator says she takes every chance to lose him while they're exploring their grandparents' farm. On the other hand, the third-person limited point of view enables narrative intrusions that counterbalance the girl's desire to desert her brother. At the beginning of the extract, the narrator remarks, the girl is supposed to be keeping an eye on her younger brother. Then, as the girl contemplates checking on her brother, the final clause in the third last sentence of the extract notes, that's what she should do. In this way, utilizing a third-person limited point of view uniquely conveys the central character's careless attitude towards her brother while subtly suggesting that such carelessness violates her responsibilities as a big sister. One final thing before we wrap up. You'll note that we've only discussed analyzing POV in this lesson and haven't really said much about creating POV. Creating narrative POV is a significant part of the planning process in the composing section, and we'll get stuck into that in Module 5. That is all the main content for the lesson. Simple summary time. First main part of the lesson, we looked at the definition of narrative point of view. Our definition is the ways in which a narrator may be related to the story. Our next main section of the lesson highlighted that narrative point of view does not equal perspective. We learned perspective is a viewpoint held by someone in the story, whereas narrative point of view is the person who's telling the story, refers to the narrator. Just think about that Ant-Man example of Kang the Conqueror. His perspective is that the multiverse should be conquered, whereas for the narrative point of view, we were getting the first-person central narration of Ant-Man. After that, we looked at the application of narrative POV in an exam context. We learned that narrative POV is relevant whenever you're analyzing or creating a narrative, and a narrative is a real or imagined story. From there, we looked at the main questions to ask when you're analyzing narrative POV. This was the most important section of the lesson, the most important stuff you should know about narrative POV. The first question to ask is, who is the narrator/person telling the story? For instance, the person telling the story in The Handmaid's Tale is the protagonist, Offred. The next main question to ask is, what point of view does the narrator tell the story from? This refers to the type of POV. In terms of first person POV, we've got first person central, and that is where the protagonist describes the events of the story from their own perspective. And we've also got first person peripheral, which is another character who is close to the protagonist, describes events of the story from their perspective. Then we looked at second person POV. Here we saw that the use of the word you implies the reader is a character in the story and the events are happening to them. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the gist. Then we looked at third person POV and the various subtypes, of which there are three. Firstly, third person limited. The narrator is not a character but follows the experiences and thoughts of one. For third person objective, the narrator is not a character but a fly on the wall, observing the actions of other characters without accessing those characters' thoughts and feelings. Finally, we have third person omniscient. This is where the narrator is not a character, but they follow the thoughts and experiences of several characters. Final main question to ask is, how can we describe the narrator? In short, type of narrator. There are two broad types of narrators, the first one being internal, and this is where the narrator is a character in the story. They're inside the story. Then there are two subtypes of internal narrators. We have unreliable. As we learned, there are further types of unreliable narrators, starting with Picaro and liar. This is where the narrator exaggerates, the Picaro, or lies, the liar. There's also the madman. This is where the narrator is mentally detached from reality. And finally, there is the naif. This is where the narrator is naive due to age, inexperience, and/or ignorance. Those are the internal unreliable narrators. Then finally, we looked at internal reliable narrators. An internal reliable narrator is one that tells the story truthfully and credibly. That's the first type of narrator, internal narrators. The second type is an external narrator. This is where the narrator is not a character in the story. They're outside of the story. They're external to it. Once again, there are several subtypes, one of which is detached. This is where the narrator is detached from the thoughts and feelings of characters. There's also a subjective external narrator. This is where the narrator reveals the thoughts and feelings of a character. We've also got an omniscient external narrator. This is where the narrator reveals thoughts and feelings of several characters and presents the audience with information the characters are unaware of. Finally, we have an intrusive external narrator. This is where the narrator comments on a scene, event, or character in the story. Then we looked at the interplay between types of POV and types of narrators. Another way to understand type of POV is simply the distance from which the narrator tells the protagonist's story. Another way to understand the type of narrator is the narrator's method of narration. Our final main section of the lesson looked at a past WACE exam question. The gist of this part of the lesson was that you should explain who the narrator is, the type of POV, and the type of narrator, and relate this information to the other elements of the question. Woof! That is all for this lesson on narrative POV. I know it was a long one, but I promise that understanding this content about narrative POV will help you a lot in other lessons in this module, especially the one on voice. You'll see what I mean when I get there. But for the time being, in order to be prepared for those later concepts that require an understanding of narrative POV, make sure you go and complete the PDF activities for this lesson on narrative POV. I'll see you in the next lesson, which is about values, assumptions, attitudes, and tone. Until then, keep it simple.